Arrogant man bullied a black single mother in the mall and slammed her on the counter, not knowing she's a Korean mafia boss's fiancé. In a world where assumptions about power are made by appearances alone, no one in that luxury shopping center expected that a single moment of cruelty would summon a darkness far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And before we dive into this shocking story filled with hidden identities, brutal consequences, and a reckoning that would turn an ordinary mall into a scene no one would ever forget, before we dive into exactly how this confrontation unfolded, I need you to do one thing: hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this story takes so many unexpected turns that if you're not locked in, the algorithm might never show you another one of our videos. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. The afternoon rush at Westbridge Luxury Mall had just begun when the atmosphere shifted, one of those subtle, electric changes that everyone senses but no one truly understands until it's far too late. Because on this particular day, the polished marble floors and the gentle hum of expensive boutiques couldn't hide the tension building around a young black single mother named Regina Marshall, who moved through the aisles with the practiced grace of someone used to being invisible, used to being overlooked, used to being dismissed as if her presence didn't matter in spaces like these, though she carried herself with a quiet dignity that ran deeper than most people in that mall would ever recognize. And as the glass doors slid open and a blonde woman in a striking red dress strutted in with her muscular boyfriend trailing behind her like hired muscle, both radiating the kind of entitlement that comes from never being told no, the atmosphere shifted again, sharper, heavier, more dangerous. And Regina could feel the weight of trouble long before she heard the woman's cutting voice echo through the checkout area, complaining about the line, the service, the audacity of people who clearly don't belong here, and especially about Regina's supposed attitude. Though Regina had barely spoken a word except, "Excuse me, I was actually in line," trying to keep her voice steady, even as the boyfriend stepped forward, using his size like a weapon, his presence designed to intimidate. And when Regina politely stood her ground, explaining she'd been waiting and asking them to simply wait their turn, the boyfriend exploded as if she'd committed some unforgivable offense against the natural order. Moving so fast, his chair scraped loudly against the pristine floor, drawing every eye in the store as he stepped into Regina's space, his voice dripping with contempt as he questioned whether she could even afford to shop here, whether she understood her place, whether she had any idea who he was and what he could do to people like her. And before Regina could step back, before she could even gather her bags to leave and avoid the confrontation, the blonde woman pulled out her phone with theatrical indignation and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Babe, don't let her disrespect you. Teach her a lesson." Because in that mall, on that day, some people wielded their privilege like a weapon, never imagining that the consequences would be far more severe than they could possibly comprehend. And within seconds, the boyfriend's hands were on Regina, grabbing her shopping bags and hurling them to the floor where her daughter's carefully chosen birthday gift, a delicate music box, shattered into pieces, with shoppers watching in stunned silence, some pulling out phones to record but none stepping forward to intervene, while mall security approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain how to handle a man so aggressive, so confident in his right to dominate this space. And the boyfriend, emboldened by the lack of resistance, by the crowd's paralyzed fear, grabbed Regina's arm with brutal force and demanded she apologize, demanded she admit she was in the wrong, demanded she learn some respect. And when Regina, her voice trembling but defiant, quietly said she hadn't done anything wrong, the blonde woman leaned in close, her phone camera recording every moment, and laughed cruelly before shouting for everyone to hear, "She's threatening us." She said her fiancé would handle this. Some imaginary gangster boyfriend is going to what? Save her? Which wasn't how it happened at all, because Regina had mentioned her fiancé, not as a threat, but as a quiet warning, simply stating that Kim wouldn't be happy about this, explaining softly that they were making a terrible mistake, that some lines shouldn't be crossed. But the boyfriend heard only what he wanted to hear, an empty threat from a powerless woman, and decided to make an example of her, to show everyone watching what happens when people who don't belong try to assert themselves in his world. And that's when everything changed. When the boyfriend made his fatal miscalculation, when he grabbed Regina by the shoulders and slammed her upper body down onto the checkout counter with sickening force, pinning her there while the blonde woman recorded and laughed, while shoppers gasped but froze, while security called for backup but didn't physically intervene, and while Regina's hand, hidden in her purse, trembling but determined, found the small emergency device her fiancé had insisted she carry. The one she'd promised to press if she ever felt truly unsafe. And as she pressed that button, as the silent signal transmitted across the city to a man whose love for her was matched only by his capacity for calculated violence, Regina whispered, through tears and pain and humiliation, "You have no idea what you've just done." But the boyfriend only laughed harder, tightening his grip. Because in his world, in his experience, women like Regina didn't have power, didn't have protection, didn't have anyone who would come for them. And he was about to discover, in the most terrifying way possible, just how catastrophically wrong he was. And I want to pause here, because if you've ever been made to feel small, if you've ever had your dignity tested while people just watch, this next part is for you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below. I know some of you have lived moments like Regina's, and your stories deserve to be heard too. Regina Marshall had perfected the art of moving through the world without taking up too much space. A survival skill she'd learned long before becoming a mother, long before the weight of raising a daughter alone taught her that silence was sometimes safer than speaking up. And on this particular Saturday afternoon, as she navigated the gleaming corridors of Westbridge Luxury Mall with 3 shopping bags balanced in one hand and her phone clutched in the other, she was doing exactly what she'd done for years, making herself invisible in places where people like her were expected to be passing through, not settling in, not belonging. The mall hummed with the kind of carefully curated energy that came with high-end retail, designer boutiques standing shoulder to shoulder with luxury department stores, everything polished and perfect and wrapped in the subtle message that not everyone was welcome to linger. Her phone buzzed again with another text from her daughter Zoe, whose 8th birthday was only 3 days away, and Regina smiled as she read the excited message filled with emojis and exclamation points asking if mommy had found the perfect gift yet. She paused near a fountain to reply, her fingers moving quickly across the screen, promising that yes, she'd found something special. Something that would make Zoe's eyes light up the way they used to before the divorce, before the move to a smaller apartment, before the weight of the world started pressing down on both of them in ways Regina worked tirelessly to shield her daughter from experiencing. As she shifted her bags to check the delicate music box she'd just purchased, nestled carefully in tissue paper, inside the smallest shopping bag, her engagement ring caught the overhead lighting for just a moment before she instinctively turned it inward, hiding the platinum band and the modest but undeniably expensive stone against her palm. It was a habit now, this concealment, this constant awareness that the ring raised questions she wasn't ready to answer. Questions about who gave it to her, about what kind of man could afford such a piece, about why she wore it turned inward like a secret instead of displayed outward like a promise. Another text lit up her screen. This one from Casey. Just 2 words that somehow carried more weight than a paragraph. "You okay?" she replied with a heart emoji. Simple and sufficient. Because explaining to Kim Chang that she was fine, that she was just shopping, that nothing was wrong would require admitting that she always felt a low-grade anxiety in places like this, and she refused to burden him with her everyday discomfort when his world already carried so much darkness. Regina made her way toward the main checkout area where she could pick up the birthday candles and wrapping paper she'd forgotten during her first pass through the department store, joining the short line behind an elderly couple carefully counting bills from their wallet, their quiet patience a stark contrast to the sharp energy suddenly cutting through the air as glass doors swept open and a woman in a red dress entered like she was walking a runway instead of a shopping mall. The blonde woman moved with the kind of aggressive confidence that demanded attention, her boyfriend trailing behind her with his muscular arms crossed. Generic tribal tattoos wrapping around his biceps, his designer casual wear somehow making him look more threatening than fashionable, and Regina felt that old familiar tightening in her chest, the one that told her to be smaller, quieter, less visible. She focused on her phone, pretending to be absorbed in messages, hoping they would simply pass by without incident, because she recognized their type immediately, recognized the way they surveyed the space as if calculating who mattered and who didn't, who belonged and who was simply tolerated. But the universe, as it often did, had different plans, because instead of walking past to browse, the couple headed directly toward the checkout counter, cutting through the line with the casual disregard of people who'd never been told no, dumping their expensive purchases on the counter right in front of Regina as if she were furniture rather than a person who'd been patiently waiting her turn. Regina took a breath, weighing her options, knowing that speaking up invited confrontation, but that staying silent meant swallowing yet another small humiliation, and she decided, in that fraction of a second, that today she would choose her dignity over her safety. Her voice came out steady, polite, almost apologetic despite having nothing to apologize for. "Excuse me. I was actually in line." The blonde woman turned slowly, her eyes sliding over Regina from head to toe with the kind of assessment that felt like a physical violation. Taking in her simple clothing, her off-brand bags, her existence in this space as if it were a personal affront. And when the woman's boyfriend stepped forward, positioning his body between Regina and the counter, his smirk told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to unfold. "You sure you can even afford to shop here?" he asked, his voice loud enough that nearby shoppers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away as if witnessing Regina's humiliation might somehow make them complicit. The cashier froze, her hand hovering over the register, clearly uncertain whether her minimum wage job required her to intervene in what was rapidly becoming a confrontation. Regina felt heat crawl up her neck, felt the familiar shame that came with being publicly questioned about her right to exist in certain spaces, but she maintained her composure because she'd had years of practice, years of swallowing disrespect for the sake of avoiding escalation. "I just asked you to wait your turn." "Asli escalation. Aslid escalation," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his with more courage than she felt. And for a moment she thought, maybe, just maybe, he would recognize her humanity and step aside. But the boyfriend only moved closer, using his size deliberately, invading her space with the casual cruelty of someone who'd learned that physical intimidation usually worked on women like her. "Or what?" he asked, his breath close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "You gonna call your baby daddy?" The blonde woman laughed, the sound sharp and performative, designed for an audience. She leaned against her boyfriend's arm, encouraging him with her amusement, feeding his aggression with her approval. "Babe, don't waste your time on people like her," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of contempt that came from never having to consider how her words landed, never having to face consequences for the small violences she inflicted daily on people she considered beneath her. And Regina stood there, bags still in hand, daughter's broken music box waiting to shatter, and felt the weight of every microaggression, every assumption, every moment she'd been made to feel less than, pressing down on her shoulders like stones. She didn't know yet that in less than 10 minutes, everything would change. That the man she loved, the man whose darkness she both feared and relied on, was already moving toward her like a storm she'd summoned without meaning to. She didn't know that this moment, this humiliation, was about to become the catalyst for something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple confrontation at a mall checkout counter. Regina tried to step around them, hoping to simply leave with whatever dignity she had remaining, but the boyfriend shifted his body deliberately, blocking her path with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, his voice carrying that edge of manufactured authority, as if he were security rather than just another customer drunk on his own sense of superiority. "You started this whole thing with your attitude." And Regina felt her composure beginning to crack, felt the careful mask she wore in public spaces starting to slip because there was only so much a person could take before the pressure became too much, before silence stopped being protection and started being complicity in her own degradation. "Please just let me pass," she said, her voice trembling slightly now, betraying the fear she'd been working so hard to conceal. And she hated herself for that tremor, hated that he could hear it, could see the effect his intimidation was having. The blonde woman pulled out her phone with theatrical flair, already angling for the perfect shot, already composing whatever narrative she would spin for her followers about the dramatic encounter she was having with a difficult customer, because in her world, everything was content, everything was performance, and Regina's humiliation was just another story to share. "This is going to be hilarious," the woman said, her thumb hovering over the record button, and Regina realized with sinking dread that whatever happened next would be documented, preserved, shared with strangers who would judge her based on a few seconds of carefully edited footage that would never capture the full context of her degradation. The boyfriend reached out suddenly and grabbed Regina's shopping bags, yanking them from her hand with enough force that she stumbled slightly, trying to maintain her balance. He held them up mockingly, examining the contents as if he had every right to invade her privacy, to touch her belongings, to treat her possessions as community property available for his inspection and judgment. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he turned the bags upside down and dumped everything onto the polished marble floor. Regina's carefully chosen purchases scattered across the ground, tissue paper unfurling, the delicate music box tumbling out and hitting the hard surface with a sickening crack that seemed to echo through the entire checkout area. The tiny ballerina inside broke free from her mechanism, the pink-painted figure rolling away from the shattered base, and Regina felt something inside her chest break along with it. "That was for my daughter's birthday," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. All pretense of composure abandoned as she stared at the destroyed gift, at the hours she'd spent searching for the perfect present now reduced to broken pieces on a mall floor. She dropped to her knees instinctively, trying to gather the fragments, trying to salvage something from the wreckage, her hands shaking as she picked up the tiny ballerina and held it in her palm like a wounded bird. The boyfriend stood over her, watching her scramble to collect the pieces, and the power dynamic was so stark, so visually clear that even the shoppers who'd been pretending not to notice couldn't look away anymore. "Shoulda thought about that before you got an attitude with us," he said, his tone suggesting she'd somehow earned this destruction, that her refusal to be invisible had justified his cruelty. Regina looked up at him from her position on the floor, shopping bags scattered around her like debris from a shipwreck, and felt something shift inside her. Some fundamental calculation about safety versus dignity, about silence versus speaking truth. "My fiancé won't be happy about this," she said quietly, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact, a warning that felt necessary, even though she knew how it would sound, knew how it would be received by people who'd already decided what kind of woman she was, what kind of life she led, what kind of power, or lack thereof, she possessed. Both of them burst into laughter, the kind that wasn't about humor but about dominance, about putting someone back in their place when they dared to suggest they had any leverage, any protection, any connections that mattered. The blonde woman doubled over slightly, clutching her boyfriend's arm as if Regina had just told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Oh my God. She has a fiancé," she managed between giggles, wiping at her eyes with exaggerated drama. "What? Some broke dude who's gonna do what exactly? Come down here and fight my boyfriend?" She gestured at her muscular companion as if his gym-built physique was somehow proof of invincibility, as if size and swagger were the ultimate arbiters of power. Mall security finally approached. Two young guards, who looked barely out of their teens, their faces betraying their uncertainty about how to handle a situation that was clearly escalating beyond their training or comfort level. "Sir, maybe we should all calm down," one of them ventured, his voice hesitant, his body language suggesting he was hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to actually intervene in any meaningful way. The boyfriend whirled on the guards with instant aggression, his entire demeanor shifting from mocking entertainment to genuine menace. "Stay out of this," he barked, pointing a finger in their faces. "I'm teaching someone a lesson. About respect. About knowing your place in the world." Regina remained on her knees, still holding the broken ballerina, and felt the full weight of her helplessness pressing down on her shoulders. Around her, shoppers had formed a loose circle, phones out, recording everything, their faces a mixture of concern and entertainment, that peculiar modern phenomenon where witnessing trauma had become indistinguishable from consuming content. No one stepped forward. No one offered to help her gather her scattered belongings. No one challenged the boyfriend's increasingly aggressive behavior. They just watched, passive audiences to her degradation. And Regina understood in that moment exactly how alone she was, how completely she existed outside the protective boundaries that shielded other people from this kind of public violence. The boyfriend grabbed her arm then, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise, yanking her upward with brutal efficiency. "Get up," he commanded, pulling her toward the checkout counter as if she were a disobedient child rather than a grown woman, as if her body belonged to him simply because he'd decided it did. Regina cried out softly, more from shock than pain, though the pain was real enough, sharp and immediate and clarifying. She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened, and she realized with terrible clarity that this was no longer just humiliation, no longer just casual cruelty. This was assault. This was violence, and still, no one moved to stop it. Her free hand fumbled for her purse, fingers searching desperately for the small device Kim had insisted she carry, the one he'd pressed into her palm months ago with instructions she'd thought were paranoid, excessive, unnecessary. "If anyone ever makes you feel unsafe, Regina," he'd said, his voice gentle but absolutely serious. Just press it. I don't care where I am or what I'm doing. You press it. And she'd nodded, humoring him, never imagining she'd actually need it, never imagining that a simple afternoon shopping for her daughter's birthday would devolve into this nightmare. Her fingers found the smooth surface of the beacon, found the button in its center, and she pressed it hard, pressed it like a prayer, pressed it like a summons for darkness to answer her desperate call for light. The boyfriend suddenly grabbed Regina's arm and yanked her toward the checkout counter with shocking violence, his fingers digging into her bicep hard enough that she knew there would be bruises tomorrow, dark purple proof of this moment, that would linger on her skin long after the humiliation faded from immediate memory. She cried out, tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened as he slammed her upper body down onto the counter with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs, the edge of the hard surface pressing into her ribs as he held her there, pinned like an insect under glass. The cashier gasped and stepped back, abandoning her register entirely, while shoppers around them froze in that peculiar paralysis that overtakes witnesses to public violence, their phones raised but their voices silent, recording but not intervening, documenting but not disrupting. Regina's cheek pressed against the cold counter surface, her vision blurred by tears that came not just from physical pain but from the crushing weight of being dehumanized in front of dozens of strangers who watched but did nothing. She could feel the boyfriend's hand on the back of her head now, holding her down with unnecessary force, his body language radiating the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he'd done this before, that he knew exactly how much pressure to apply to hurt without leaving marks that would photograph well, that he'd calculated precisely how far he could go in a public space before someone with actual authority might step in. The blonde woman moved closer, her phone still recording, angling for the perfect shot of Regina's humiliation. "This is what happens to people who don't know their place," she announced to her phone camera. To her future audience, to the world she was curating one post at a time. Other shoppers had formed a tighter circle now, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, several filming from different angles as if they were documenting a theatrical performance rather than witnessing an actual assault. A few whispered amongst themselves, expressing vague concern but taking no action, as if their quiet disapproval somehow absolved them of responsibility to intervene. Security had called for backup, their radios crackling with urgent requests for additional personnel. But they still didn't physically engage, didn't put their bodies between Regina and her attacker, didn't use whatever authority their uniforms theoretically granted them to stop what was happening right in front of them. Regina's voice came out strained, her face still pressed against the counter, each word requiring effort as the boyfriend's weight restricted her breathing. "You're making a terrible mistake," she managed. And even through her fear and pain, there was something in her tone that should have given them pause, some quality of certainty that suggested she knew something they didn't, that this story wasn't ending the way they assumed it would. But the boyfriend only leaned down closer, his mouth near her ear, whispering loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "The only mistake here is you thinking you matter," he said, each word deliberate and cruel. "The only mistake is you thinking anyone's coming to save you." She turned her head slightly, enough to whisper back, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "Kim won't forgive this." The boyfriend laughed, a harsh bark of amusement. The blonde woman practically shrieked with delight. "Kim who?" she called out mockingly. "Your imaginary rich boyfriend? Your fantasy gangster protector?" She turned to the crowd, playing to her audience. "She thinks someone's going to rescue her, as if some man is just going to appear but Regina wasn't listening anymore because her hand had found the emergency beacon in her purse, had pressed the button with desperate finality. And she knew with absolute certainty that across the city, in whatever dark room or dangerous meeting he was conducting, Kim Chang's phone was vibrating with a pattern he would recognize instantly, a signal that would transform him from the man she loved into the predator his enemies feared. The boyfriend tightened his grip on Regina's hair now, preparing to drag her up from the counter, to throw her aside like garbage he'd finished examining. Regina's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the crushing humiliation of being brutalized while her daughter's broken gift lay scattered on the floor, while strangers filmed but didn't help, while the world confirmed once again that women like her existed outside the protective boundaries that shielded others from violence. The blonde woman leaned in close, her expression triumphant, her voice carrying across the checkout area. Anybody else want to defend her? She challenged the crowd, daring anyone to contradict the narrative she was constructing. The story where she and her boyfriend were somehow the victims of Regina's attitude, where their violence was justified response, rather than unprovoked cruelty. Silence answered her. People shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one moved forward. No one was willing to risk becoming the next target of the boyfriend's aggression. And in that silence, in that collective failure of human decency, something fundamental shifted in the mall's atmosphere. Though no one could identify it yet, couldn't name the electricity building in the air like the pressure before a storm. Outside, beyond the glass walls and polished corridors, black SUVs were already moving through traffic with predatory efficiency. And inside an underground meeting room across the city, Kim Chang was walking out with an expression that made every man in his organization reach instinctively for weapons, because they recognized that look, had seen it only once before, and they knew it meant someone had made the fatal mistake of touching the only thing in the world their boss considered sacred. The boyfriend finally released Regina, shoving her backward with enough force that she stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself against a display rack that rattled under the impact of her weight. She steadied herself, breathing hard, one hand instinctively moving to her ribs, where the counter edge had left them aching and tender. The blonde woman circled her like a predator, still filming, still performing for her phone camera, and the growing crowd of spectators who had abandoned their shopping entirely to watch this public spectacle unfold. "Look at her," the woman said with contempt dripping from every syllable. "Playing victim like they always do. Like she didn't start all of this with her attitude." Store management had finally arrived. A middle-aged man in a cheap suit, whose name tag identified him as a supervisor, but his presence changed nothing because he stood at the edge of the scene looking helpless and overwhelmed, clearly calculating whether his retail job required him to physically confront a violent customer or whether he could simply wait for actual police to arrive and handle the situation. "Sir, please," he ventured weakly, his hands raised in a placating gesture that communicated surrender rather than authority. "We've called the authorities. They're on their way." The boyfriend whirled on him with instant aggression. "Good. Have them arrest her for causing a disturbance, for threatening us, for assaulting me when I tried to defend my girlfriend." Regina stood there, her shopping scattered around her feet like evidence of a crime scene, her daughter's broken music box just visible among the wreckage, and she felt something inside her go cold and hard and determined. She reached down and grabbed the shattered gift, held the broken ballerina in her palm, and when she looked up at the boyfriend and his girlfriend, her eyes held something they didn't recognize, couldn't interpret, because they'd never encountered a woman who'd been pushed past fear into the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. The boyfriend noticed her stare and misread it entirely, stepping toward her again, reaching for her purse this time, yanking it from her shoulder before she could stop him. He dumped the contents across the checkout counter with theatrical cruelty, her wallet spilling open, credit cards and her driver's license sliding across the surface, her phone clattering against the register, loose change scattering like shrapnel, and among the debris, a small photograph slipped out. The kind parents carry of their children, this one showing a beautiful 8-year-old girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a princess costume from last Halloween. The boyfriend picked it up, held it between his fingers like it was contaminated, examined it with exaggerated interest. "This the kid?" he asked, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire checkout area. "She's gonna grow up just as entitled as her mama, thinking she belongs in places she doesn't, thinking the world owes her something just for existing." Regina's voice came out low and dangerous, every word carefully controlled despite the rage building behind them. "Don't," she said, taking a step toward him despite his size advantage, despite the very real possibility he would hit her again. "Don't talk about my daughter." But he only laughed and pocketed the photograph, a casual theft that somehow felt more violating than the physical assault, more personal than the humiliation he'd already inflicted. The blonde woman moved in closer, her phone camera capturing Regina's anguish in high definition, documenting the moment a mother's protective instincts overrode her survival instincts, because there were some lines that, once crossed, made consequences irrelevant. Regina found her voice then, found her strength, drew herself up to her full height despite the pain radiating through her ribs, despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "Give me back my daughter's picture," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation, and for just a moment something flickered in the boyfriend's expression, Some recognition that he might have pushed too far, that maybe this wasn't the easy target he'd assumed. But the moment passed and his arrogance reasserted itself. His hand moving to shove her again. And that's when Regina saw it. That's when everyone saw it. The subtle vibration, starting in the floor beneath their feet. The deep rumble of multiple powerful engines approaching from outside. The blonde woman noticed it too, her smile faltering slightly as she glanced toward the mall entrance where shadows were moving, where the afternoon sunlight was being blocked by large vehicles pulling up to the curb with military precision. Young black teenager in the crowd, the same one who'd been filming since the beginning, started crying openly now, his phone shaking in his hands as he captured everything. His mother stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, her face a mixture of grief and recognition because she understood exactly what was happening, had lived through enough similar moments to know how these situations ended, how often women like Regina were brutalized while the world watched and did nothing. The boyfriend was still holding Regina's daughter's photograph, still wearing his confident smirk, still completely unaware that outside in the parking lot, Kim Chang was stepping out of a black SUV with an expression that would have sent any intelligent person running, still oblivious to the fact that the men now entering through the mall's main entrance weren't security or police but something far more dangerous, far more final, still convinced that his size and his aggression and his privilege would protect him from consequences, because they always had before, because the world had taught him that women like Regina existed to be dominated, to be put in their place, to be reminded that power belonged to people like him. But the ground was trembling now, the air pressure changing, and Regina touched her engagement ring with her free hand, drawing strength from that small circle of metal and stone, and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "He's coming. You have no idea what you've done." The boyfriend scoffed, started to respond with another mocking comment, but his words died in his throat as he finally noticed what everyone else had already seen, the crowd parting like water, the dangerous-looking men in black suits forming a perimeter, and at the center of it all, walking with terrifying calm, a man whose presence seemed to drain all the oxygen from the space around him. Across the city, in an industrial warehouse district where legitimate businesses feared to operate, Kim Chang sat at the head of a long table in a windowless room thick with cigarette smoke and the particular tension that comes from men discussing how to divide territory they don't legally own. The space smelled of concrete and ambition, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across faces that had seen too much violence to be surprised by anything. Men whose loyalty was purchased with fear and money in equal measure. Kim looked every inch the part of what he was. Sharp Korean features that could have belonged to a corporate executive, traditional tattoos creeping up his neck from beneath his collar, the intricate patterns telling stories only certain people knew how to read, his black suit tailored with a precision that cost more than most people earned in a month. His lieutenant was mid-presentation, using a tablet to display shipping routes and financial projections, explaining in careful detail how they could expand their operations without drawing federal attention, when Kim's phone vibrated against the polished table surface, with a pattern that made everyone in the room go silent. Not the normal buzz of a call or text, but something specific, something urgent, something they'd never actually heard before despite knowing what it meant. Kim's hand moved to the phone with controlled speed, his entire body language shifting in the span of a heartbeat from the relaxed posture of a man conducting routine business to the coiled tension of a predator who'd just detected a threat to something precious. He checked the screen and saw what he'd hoped never to see. Regina's emergency beacon flashing red with her location coordinates displayed beneath it like an accusation. Westbridge Luxury Mall. His jaw clenched tight enough that the muscles in his neck stood out in sharp relief, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone like he was trying to strangle the information it contained. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping across concrete with a sound like a gunshot. And every man at that table stopped breathing because they recognized that expression, had seen variations of it before people disappeared or buildings burned or territories changed hands overnight. "Meeting over," Kim said, his voice deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. "Get every available man. Right now." His lieutenant started to ask the obvious question. Started to form the words that would clarify what emergency could possibly interrupt business this important, but Kim cut him off with two words that made the room go cold. Someone touched Regina. And just like that, everything changed. Because every man in that organization knew who Regina was, knew she was the only person their ruthless boss had ever shown vulnerability for, the only weakness in his otherwise impenetrable armor, the only thing in the world he valued more than power or money or his own life. Kim was already moving toward the door, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders in rapid Korean as his men scrambled to follow. I want 15 men, full presence, weapons concealed but ready, Westbridge Mall. Anyone not in a vehicle in 60 seconds gets left behind. His lieutenant grabbed his jacket and keys, already coordinating with other crew leaders, already pulling up maps and calculating routes, because when Kim moved with this kind of focused rage, you didn't ask questions, you just executed orders and prayed you were fast enough to keep up. As Kim strode through the warehouse toward the waiting vehicles, his mind flashed back unbidden to the first time he'd seen Regina, 2 years ago at a community center in a neighborhood he'd been surveying for expansion opportunities. She'd been volunteering, organizing a food drive for families in need, moving through the space with genuine warmth and compassion that seemed to create light wherever she went, and he'd been instantly captivated by her kindness, by how different she was from everyone in his world, from every woman who'd ever approached him seeking the danger and excitement his reputation promised. He remembered standing in the doorway watching her comfort a crying child, remembered thinking that someone that good shouldn't exist in a world this corrupt, shouldn't be accessible to someone like him who'd built an empire on violence and fear. Another memory surfaced, sharper and more recent, the night he'd given her the emergency beacon disguised as a simple key fob, the night he'd held her face in his hands and made her promise to use it if she ever felt unsafe. My world is dark, Regina, he told her, his voice carrying a vulnerability he'd never shown another living soul. But you're the only light I've ever wanted to protect. If anyone hurts you, they'll learn what darkness really means. She'd nodded. Humoring him, he thought, never imagining she'd actually need it, because he'd been so careful to keep his world separate from hers, to shield her from the reality of who he was and what he did. Now Kim was in the lead SUV, a convoy of black vehicles racing through city traffic with terrifying efficiency, running red lights and taking corners at speeds that scattered pedestrians and sent other drivers swerving to avoid collision. His expression had settled into something worse than anger, worse than rage, a kind of terrifying calm that only came when he'd already decided someone was going to die and was simply calculating how painful he could make their final moments. He tried calling Regina repeatedly, each unanswered ring cranking his fury tighter, each moment of silence filling his imagination with scenarios that made his hands shake against the steering wheel. The driver glanced at him nervously, had never seen the boss like this, and wisely kept his mouth shut as they took the highway exit at 70 miles an hour, weaving through traffic like the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules. Kim's lieutenant in the passenger seat was coordinating with the other vehicles, ensuring everyone knew the destination. Everyone understood that when they arrived, they were to secure every exit and make sure no one left without permission. And in the back of Kim's mind, beneath the cold calculation and lethal focus, was a voice screaming that Regina had been alone and afraid and in danger for however many minutes it took him to reach her, that someone had dared to touch her, to hurt her, to make her feel unsafe in a world where his entire purpose had become ensuring she never felt those things again. Back at the mall, the situation had deteriorated beyond simple assault into something darker and more deliberately cruel, because the boyfriend had Regina on the floor now, standing over her with the posture of a man who'd won some kind of contest, whose victory required her complete degradation to feel satisfying. Regina clutched her side where the counter edge had bruised her ribs, breathing hard through the pain, trying to protect herself, while maintaining whatever shred of dignity remained available to someone being publicly brutalized, while strangers filmed for entertainment. The blonde woman had her phone out again, but this time she wasn't just recording. She was posting in real time, her thumbs flying across the screen as she crafted the perfect caption to accompany the video of Regina's humiliation. Dealing with a crazy woman at the mall drama number shopping while black, she typed, already imagining the engagement metrics, the comments from followers who would validate her version of events without ever questioning what had actually happened. The store manager had finally arrived, a middle-aged man whose name tag identified him as someone with authority he clearly had no intention of exercising, standing at a safe distance with his hands raised in a gesture of helpless surrender. "Sir, please, we've called the authorities," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone reading from a crisis management manual rather than actually intervening in a crisis. The boyfriend whirled on him with contempt. "Good. Have them arrest her for causing a disturbance, for threatening us, for starting this whole mess." He turned back to Regina, reached down and grabbed her purse from where it had fallen, and with theatrical malice dumped the entire contents across the pristine mall floor. Regina's life scattered in front of the crowd like evidence at a crime scene. Her phone sliding across marble, her wallet spilling open to reveal credit cards and identification, Loose change rolling in different directions, lipstick and tissues and the mundane debris everyone carries. And among it all, a small photograph that the boyfriend picked up with exaggerated interest, holding it up to examine in the overhead lighting. The image showed a beautiful child with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a princess costume that any parent would recognize as evidence of love and care and special occasions worth celebrating. "This the kid?" he asked, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire checkout area, addressing the crowd as much as Regina. She's gonna grow up just as entitled as her mama, thinking she belongs everywhere, thinking the world owes her something. Regina's voice broke as she spoke, raw emotion overtaking whatever composure she'd managed to maintain. "Don't," she said, the word coming out like a plea and a warning simultaneously. "Don't talk about my daughter." Something shifted in her then, some fundamental calculation about what mattered more than safety, what was worth fighting for, even when fighting meant certain defeat. And she pushed herself up from the floor despite the pain, despite the boyfriend's intimidating presence, despite every survival instinct screaming at her to stay down and wait for help that might never arrive. But the moment she got her feet under her, the boyfriend shoved her backward with casual cruelty, sending her sprawling again, her head narrowly missing the edge of a display stand. In the crowd, a young black teenager, maybe 14 years old, had started crying, tears streaming down his face as he filmed everything on his phone with shaking hands. His mother stood beside him, trying to pull him away, trying to protect him from witnessing this trauma, from carrying this memory. But he resisted her gentle tugging. "Mom, someone has to record this," he said through his tears, his voice cracking with emotion and determination. "Someone has to make sure people see what they did to her." The blonde woman noticed him, noticed his tears and his phone and his witness, and turned her own camera toward him with mocking amusement. "Oh, look. Another one filming," she announced to her social media audience. "You people always play victim. Always make everything about race when it's really just about respect and knowing your place." The ground beneath their feet had started to vibrate subtly, a low rumble that most people dismissed as construction or distant traffic, engines approaching from outside the mall, but still too far away for anyone to identify the source. No one paid attention because they were too focused on Regina's degradation, too absorbed in the spectacle of her suffering to notice the atmospheric pressure changing, the air growing heavier with approaching threat. Regina's hand moved to her engagement ring, the one she usually kept turned inward to hide, and she twisted it outward now, letting it catch the light, drawing strength from that small circle of metal and stone and promise. She looked up at the boyfriend with something like pity in her eyes, like she could see his immediate future and knew it was far worse than he could imagine. "He's coming," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear over the mall's ambient noise. "You have no idea what you've done," the boyfriend scoffed, that dismissive sound men make when they're absolutely certain of their superiority, when they've never encountered consequences severe enough to teach them humility. "Still with the fantasy boyfriend story?" he said, playing to his audience again. "Still pretending some man is gonna come save you? Pathetic." But outside in the parking lot, black SUVs were pulling up with military precision. And inside those vehicles, men who'd built careers on violence were checking weapons and awaiting orders. And at the head of that convoy, Kim Chang was stepping out into afternoon sunlight with murder in his eyes and Regina's name on his lips like a prayer he intended to answer with blood. Multiple black SUVs screeched to a halt outside the mall's main entrance with the synchronized precision of a military operation, their tires leaving dark marks on pristine pavement as engines idled with threatening power. Inside the stores, the cheerful pop music that had been providing ambient shopping soundtrack suddenly felt too loud, too jarring against the strange tension building in the air, that electric quality that precedes violence the way humidity precedes storms. The SUV doors opened in perfect unison, and men emerged wearing black suits that couldn't quite conceal the dangerous energy radiating from their coordinated movements. Some with visible tattoos creeping up their necks, all of them moving with the kind of disciplined purpose that made mall security immediately tense and reach for radios, recognizing something far outside their training and pay grade. Shoppers near the entrance scattered instinctively, that primal survival instinct that makes civilians move away from predators even before their conscious minds have identified the threat, parents grabbing children's hands and hurrying towards side exits, teenagers lowering their phones and backing towards store entrances. And then Kim Chang walked through the main entrance like death itself had decided to go shopping. His movements calm and purposeful and absolutely terrifying in their controlled intensity, every step radiating the kind of lethal focus that cleared paths through crowds without him needing to say a word or make a gesture. His men formed a loose perimeter behind him, not overtly aggressive but unmistakably present, their positioning calculated to control exits and sightlines, to ensure nothing happened in this space without their awareness and permission. People throughout the mall were pulling out phones now, filming this new development, sensing that whatever was unfolding was bigger than the assault they'd been documenting, more significant than the public humiliation of one woman by an entitled couple. Kim's eyes scanned the crowd with predatory efficiency until they locked onto the scene at the checkout counter, until he saw Regina on the floor, surrounded by scattered belongings, saw the boyfriend standing over her with proprietary arrogance, saw the blonde woman laughing and filming. And his expression didn't change, but something in the air itself seemed to shift, to darken, as if his rage had physical weight that pressed down on everyone in proximity. He moved through the mall with crowds parting instinctively before him. Store to store, people stopped shopping entirely, drawn by the atmospheric shift, by the sense that something unprecedented was occurring. The boyfriend finally noticed the crowd's attention had redirected, finally saw the dangerous-looking men approaching, finally registered that people were staring past him with expressions mixing fear and fascination. The blonde woman's smile faltered as she lowered her phone, as she realized everyone was looking at something behind her, as uncertainty crept into her previously absolute confidence. Kim stopped 10 feet away from them, his eyes taking in every detail with the precision of someone cataloging evidence for later retribution. Regina's torn shirt, her scattered belongings, the broken music box still visible among the debris, the tears on her face, the way she held her ribs protectively. The boyfriend, still operating on assumptions that were about to prove catastrophically wrong, puffed out his chest and stepped toward Kim with aggressive posturing. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone who'd never encountered real danger. Who thought gym muscles and swagger constituted power? Kim didn't answer, didn't acknowledge the question. Simply walked directly toward Regina as if the boyfriend didn't exist, as if he were furniture to be moved around rather than a person to be addressed. The boyfriend made his fatal mistake then, reaching out to grab Kim's arm to stop him, to assert his dominance over this space and this situation. Kim's response was so fast that most people missed it. One fluid motion where he grabbed the boyfriend's wrist and twisted it with the practiced precision of someone who'd broken bones professionally, applying just enough pressure that the larger man cried out in pain and dropped to his knees, his face contorting as he realized how completely he'd miscalculated. Kim looked down at him without anger or satisfaction, just cold assessment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and accented and absolutely chilling in its controlled menace. "You touched my fiancé," he said, each word deliberate and final, carrying the weight of a death sentence being handed down by a judge who'd already decided the verdict. The blonde woman's face drained of color so rapidly she looked like she might faint, her phone forgotten in her hand as the word fiancé registered and her entire narrative collapsed around her. "Fiancé," she stammered, her eyes moving between Kim's expensive suit and traditional tattoos and Regina's simple clothing and scattered belongings. Her brain refusing to process the connection, refusing to accept that this woman she dismissed as powerless was engaged to someone who radiated danger like heat from a furnace. But she never finished the sentence because Kim's lieutenant, a man with scars across his knuckles and eyes that had seen too much death to be shocked by anything, stepped forward and cut her off with quiet authority. "Choose your next words very carefully," he said, his tone suggesting that her next breath depended entirely on her ability to demonstrate sudden wisdom. The entire checkout area had gone silent, the kind of profound quiet that follows explosions. Everyone frozen in place, watching this reversal of power that seemed to violate every assumption they'd made about how the world worked, about who mattered and who didn't, about whose protection extended where and how far. Kim released the boyfriend's wrist and let him collapse onto the floor, dismissing him like garbage no longer worth his attention, as he knelt beside Regina with a transformation so complete it seemed impossible. The same man could contain both versions of himself. His entire demeanor shifted from lethal predator to tender protector, his hand moving to her face with gentleness that contradicted everything his presence had just communicated to everyone watching. "Jagia?" he asked softly, using the Korean endearment that made Regina's tears flow freely now, all the fear and pain and humiliation she'd been holding back, finally breaking through her composure. "Kim, I'm sorry, I tried not to," she started, her voice breaking, but he touched her face softly and shook his head. "Shh. Never apologize for someone else's cruelty," he said, his accented voice carrying absolute conviction, and he helped her stand with the kind of tender care reserved for precious things that had been damaged but could still be repaired. He pulled her close, one arm around her shoulders, and over her head his eyes found the boyfriend who was still on his knees, now truly terrified, as reality crashed through his earlier arrogance and showed him exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Kim spoke in rapid Korean to his men, instructions that flowed with the efficiency of someone used to giving orders that would be executed without question or hesitation. Two men immediately moved to block all exits, positioning themselves with casual authority that made it clear no one was leaving without permission. Mall security tried to intervene, one guard stepping forward with his hand raised. "Sir, you can't just—" But Kim's lieutenant moved smoothly between them and flashed something from his jacket, a badge or identification, or perhaps just something that looked official enough to make security back off immediately, hands raised in surrender as they retreated to a safe distance and pretended they hadn't seen anything worth reporting. Kim turned his attention to the young black teenager who'd been filming since the beginning. The boy still crying but holding his phone steady, documenting everything with the determination of someone who understood that truth required witnesses. "You recorded what happened to her?" Kim asked, his voice gentle now, nothing threatening in his tone. The boy nodded, scared but brave, meeting Kim's eyes even though every instinct probably told him to look away. "Yes, sir. All of it." Kim's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Send it to this number," he said. Rattling off digits, the boy scrambled to type into his phone. "You did the right thing. The world needs more people like you." The blonde woman had been slowly edging backward, trying to disappear into the crowd, trying to extract herself from a situation that had spiraled so far beyond her control she could barely process what was happening. But Kim's voice stopped her cold. Just two words that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Not yet." She froze mid-step, trembling visibly now. All her earlier confidence evaporated like water on hot pavement. Kim's attention returned to the boyfriend who was still on his knees, his wrist already swelling where Kim had applied pressure, his face pale and sweating as he realized how completely the power dynamic had reversed. "You put your hands on her," Kim said, his voice conversational now, almost friendly, which somehow made the threat more terrifying. "You humiliated her. You mocked her child." The boyfriend started stuttering immediately, words tumbling over each other in desperate appeal. I didn't know, man, I swear." "She didn't say who." Kim cut him off with a look. "She shouldn't have to. Every woman deserves dignity. Every mother deserves protection. But you chose violence." His men moved closer, forming a tighter circle around the couple, their presence transforming the checkout area into something resembling a courtroom where verdict had already been decided. "Here's what happens next," Kim continued, his tone leaving no room for negotiation or appeal. "You will apologize. Then you will leave this city. If I ever hear your name again, if you ever touch another woman, if you ever show your face, anywhere I operate." He paused deliberately, letting silence do the work that explicit threats couldn't improve. "You'll discover that there are fates worse than arrest." The boyfriend was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face as he nodded frantically. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please." But Kim didn't even look at him. His attention already moved on to more important concerns. "Not to me," he said coldly. "To her." The boyfriend crawled toward Regina on his hands and knees, a pathetic sight that would have been satisfying if it wasn't so fundamentally disturbing, his earlier swagger completely destroyed by fear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me," he begged. But Regina looked down at him and then at Kim, uncertainty clear in her eyes about this kind of justice, about whether revenge delivered through fear was truly justice at all. She didn't respond to the apology, didn't acknowledge his pleading, just turned away and let Kim's arm tighten protectively around her shoulders. Kim spoke to his lieutenant in English now, wanting everyone to understand. Make sure they understand the terms of their departure, and find out everything about them. Employers, family, friends, they need motivation to stay gone. The blonde woman finally found her voice, desperation making her reckless. "You can't do this. This is America. We have rights." Kim's smile was razor-thin, containing no warmth or humor. "And you exercised those rights to assault someone weaker than you," he said quietly. "Welcome to consequences." Days later, the mall incident had exploded across social media with the viral intensity that only comes from footage capturing something people desperately need to see. Multiple angles of video showing the assault, Kim's arrival, the forced apology, each perspective adding layers to a story that refused simple interpretation. Media outlets covered it but carefully, their language dancing around explicit identification. Because no journalist wanted to directly name Kim Chang or his organization, their legal departments recognizing danger when they saw it. Headlines emerged that told truth through omission. Mystery man rescues assault victim at mall, and viral video shows dramatic confrontation after racist attack, each trying to capture the complexity of what had happened without exposing themselves to consequences from either law enforcement or underworld figures who preferred operating in shadows. Regina sat in Kim's penthouse apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city where she'd been brutalized and rescued in equal measure, watching news coverage with emotions so mixed she couldn't name them all. Her daughter Zoe played in the next room, blissfully unaware of everything, her 8-year-old world still intact, despite how close it had come to shattering. Kim sat beside Regina on the leather sofa, not touching her, but present in that way he had, of making space feel safer, simply by occupying it. "You're troubled," he said quietly, not a question, but an observation from someone who'd learned to read her silences. "I'm grateful you came," Regina said, her eyes still fixed on the television screen, showing footage of her on the mall floor. "But Kim, the way you handled it, the fear you put in them." She trailed off, trying to articulate discomfort she barely understood herself. Kim's response was simple and direct. "They put fear in you first." She turned to look at him finally, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite identify. "I know, but sometimes I wonder if being with you means I'm just accepting that violence is the only answer, that might makes right, that the world is just about who can hurt, who worse." Kim was quiet for a long moment, processing her words with the careful consideration he usually reserved for strategic decisions. Regina continued, her voice gaining strength as she found the words. "I love you. You've protected me, provided for us, treated me like a queen. But I'm raising a daughter. What do I tell her? That mommy needs a dangerous man to be safe? That the only way to survive is to attach yourself to someone who rules through fear?" Kim's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "You tell her that her mother is brave, strong, and deserving of respect with or without me. But you also tell her that the world is not always just. And sometimes protection comes from unexpected places, from people society tells us to fear, from places we're taught not to look." Regina made a decision then, something unprecedented that went against every instinct Kim had to keep her separate from his public presence. She decided to record a statement, to speak directly to the viral audience that had consumed her trauma like entertainment. Within hours of posting, her video had been viewed millions of times, shared across platforms, dissected by commentators and activists and ordinary people, trying to make sense of what justice looked like in a world where systems failed so consistently. In the video, she sat composed and powerful, every word carefully chosen but delivered with raw honesty. "My name is Regina Marshall. I'm a single mother, a black woman, and I was assaulted at Westbridge Mall for the crime of existing in a space someone felt I didn't belong. The man who hurt me didn't see me as human, but someone did. My fiancé, a man whose world I don't always understand, whose methods I don't always agree with, who comes from a place of darkness I'll never fully know. He saw me. He protected me. And that reveals something uncomfortable about our world. I shouldn't need someone powerful to be treated with dignity. But I did. And I was lucky enough to have it. Every woman, every mother, every person of color who's been victimized and told they're playing the victim, they deserve that protection too. Not from gangsters or soldiers or vigilantes. From laws. From society. From basic human decency. Until that world exists, I'm grateful for the protection I have. But I'll never stop fighting for the world where no one needs it." The video sparked intense debate that spread across think pieces and social media arguments and dinner table conversations about power and protection and privilege, about what justice meant when legal systems failed, about whether private vengeance could ever substitute for public accountability. The boyfriend and blonde woman had disappeared completely, rumor placing them in another state, living under assumed identities, forever looking over their shoulders, their social media accounts deleted, their former lives abandoned. Westbridge Mall implemented new security protocols and mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff. The teenager who'd filmed everything received scholarship offers from organizations inspired by his courage, his witness elevated as an example of moral clarity in moments requiring immediate action. Kim watched Regina's video alone in his office, saw her growth and complexity, recognized that protecting her meant sometimes letting her be vulnerable in ways that terrified him. That evening, he found her on the balcony and told her simply, "You're stronger than my protection." "You always were." Regina smiled. The first genuine smile since the incident. "Maybe. But I'm also smart enough to know I don't have to face the world alone. Now, if this story moved you, if it surprised you, if it made you think, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Regina's don't just entertain, they remind us that power isn't always what it looks like. And there's one final scene that brings everything full circle. The final scene came weeks later. Regina and Zoe at a different mall shopping for shoes. Her daughter chattering about school friends and upcoming birthday parties. A stranger accidentally bumped Zoe's shoulder while reaching for a display, and Regina tensed immediately, old trauma rising like floodwater, her body preparing for confrontation before her mind could process the situation. But the stranger turned with immediate concern. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Regina exhaled slowly, feeling tension drain from her shoulders as she smiled. "She's fine. Thank you for asking." As they walked away hand in hand, Regina pulled out her phone and sent Kim a photo of Zoe trying on sparkly sneakers. Captioned simply, "We're okay. The world is a little kinder today." His response came immediately, "Because you're in it." And Regina thought to herself, forming words that would become her truth, that justice isn't always clean and protection isn't always comfortable and love isn't always simple. But surviving isn't about perfection, it's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it from you, by whatever means necessary.